Instead of deporting them, the request was turned down. The Jews were sent to Auschwitz. But no part of all this bloody work is so shocking and terrible as that of the million Jewish children whose blood was spilt like water throughout Europe. How they were separated by force from their mothers who tried to hide them, murdered and thrown out of trucks in the camps, torn to pieces before their mothers' eyes, their little heads smashed on the ground. These and others are the most terrible passages of the tale of slaughter. You will hear evidence of actions which the mind of man doesn't want to believe. You will hear about little ones thrown out of windows of hospitals when they fail to respond to orders that they report for parade. We shall present to you the instructions issued by Eichmann and his office about the transport of children. One of these said that the children were to be divided among the transports intended for Auschwitz. Children of 14 were considered independent for purposes of transport to the extermination camp. Nor can we say who suffered the more terrible fate, those who died or those who concealed themselves in every conceivable hiding place and crevice, who lived in perpetual terror of expulsion, who survived by grace of Christian neighbors who agreed to hide them. Children would come home from the schools and centers organized by the community to find their parents. Home was empty, for they had been sent by some action or operation to their deaths, and their department had in the meantime been occupied by others. You will hear evidence of tender infants pressed by their mothers to their bodies in the gas chambers, so that they were not immediately poisoned, until the executioners came and threw them alive into the furnaces or the ready graves. Those unhappy children who lived for years in fear of the beating of a rifle butt on their door, who had been sent by their parents to the woods in an attempt to save them, who had been taught to choke their tears and sighs because a weeping child would be shot on the spot, who had been ordered to deny their origins and pretend to be Christians, who saw their fathers being lashed with whips before their eyes, in front of whom discussions would be carried on by the German executions as to who should be killed first, the father or the son, who went to the open grave with "Hear, O Israel" on their lips. These children and youths, who despite all the desperate measures and concealments would finally fall into the hands of their hunters, they are the very soul and innermost core of the indictment. Those Anne Franks and Justine Drangers and a million others, those unplumbed treasures of radiant youth and hope for life and achievement, they were the future of the Jewish people. He that destroyed them was seeking to destroy the Jewish people. We shall present the pictures of some of those children, swollen with hunger, frightened and crushed, with eyes frozen with terror. We shall show you the photographs of their starved bodies thrown into manure wagons, of the helpless little ones on the thresholds of the extermination chambers. Perhaps we shall succeed in painting a pale and inadequate picture of the calamity wide as the ocean that overtook the house of Israel.
It is no wonder that the German Foreign Ministry passed on for Eichmann's information the warning broadcast by London radio that those responsible for the murders in Auschwitz would be brought to judgment. Even on the verge of the German collapse in April 1945, in that atmosphere of the twilight of the gods, when the Allies from the east and west and south were closing in, Eichmann still told the German Red Cross man that he could not agree to the more humanitarian methods of dealing with Jews then being considered by Himmler. Is it any wonder then that one of those days he said to a close assistant that he would be ready to commit suicide and that he would gladly leap into his grave after he had succeeded in exterminating 5 million Jews? In this too he may be followed in the footsteps of his master Hitler, who also said that he would die happy with the knowledge of Germany's great achievements and her contribution to history. German-occupied territory in the Soviet Union and annexed areas. At first, people were murdered in their clothes. Later, as testified by Paul Flobel, a member of Eichmann's unit, the system was changed. The victims were ordered to undress and were left naked. Let us listen to a description of the procedure. The people who had got off the trucks, men, women and children of all ages, had to undress upon the order of an SS man who carried a riding or a dog whip, and put down their clothing in fixed places, sorted according to shoes, top clothing and underclothing. There lay a heap of shoes of about 800 to 1,000 pairs, great piles of underlinen and clothing. Without screaming or weeping, these people undressed, stood around in family groups, kissed each other, said their farewells, and waited for a sign from another SS man who stood near the pit, also with a whip in his hand. No complaints or pleas for mercy were heard. A family of about 8 persons passes by, a man and a woman, both about 50, with their children of about 1, 8 and 10, and 2 grown-up daughters of 20 to 24. An old woman with snow-white hair was holding the 1-year child in her arms, singing to it and tickling it. The child was cooing with delight. The couple were looking on with tears in their eyes. The father was holding the hand of a boy about 10 years old and speaking to him softly. The boy was fighting his tears. The father pointed towards the sky, stroked his head, and seemed to explain something to him. At that moment, the SS man of the pit shouted something to his comrade. The latter counted off about 20 persons and instructed them to go behind the pit. Among them was the family which I mentioned. A girl, slim and with black hair, as she passed by a German, pointed to herself and said, 23. People were closely wedged together and lying on top of each other so that only their heads were visible. All had blood pouring from them. Some of the people shot were still moving. Some were lifting their arms and turning their heads to show that they were still alive. The pit contained about 1,000 people. The executioner was an SS man who sat at the narrow opening of the trench, his feet dangling inside. He held a machine gun on his knee and a cigarette in his mouth. The people, completely naked, descended a few steps cut into the clay wall of the trench, placed their heads on the heads of those already lying there, as instructed by the SS men. They lay before the dead or the wounded. A few stroked those who were still alive and spoke to them softly. Then came a volley of shots. In the trench, the bodies were twitching on top of the motionless bodies that lay before them. Blood was running from their necks. The next batch was already approaching. They went down into the pit, placed themselves by the earlier victims, and were shot. Unquote. First, the articles and valuables were taken and plundered, and then to the open grave. In Kiev, within the space of only 2 days, 33,771 Jews were massacred. Throughout, the report speaks in clear and simple language of executions and extermination. The reports were received in Berlin, and Eichmann was able to keep a continuous check on the bloody work in the East, where the number of killings mounted from tens to hundreds of thousands. I have already mentioned Eichmann's visit to Minsk and Lvov, where he saw with his own eyes the operations of the murderers. But we have already seen why Eichmann rejected the system of direct murder. The SS men themselves began to grumble. Eichmann considered that the methods used turned people into sadists, while others said that it was not an elegant way of killing. It was then that the gas vans were delivered, and these were camouflaged in various ways. From the summaries of the exterminations in these districts, covering a period of 8 months, during 1941 to 2, we obtained a terrible total of over 720,000 Jews murdered. But even then the tragedy was not yet complete. I have already spoken of Rosenberg's brown file and the changes introduced by Eichmann in the instructions issued by the Minister for Occupation
to his foreign ministry, and I quote, "Until the issuing of further instructions, I have ordered that the Jewish Coruts be further detained at the concentration camp at Riga." Court will forgive me if I shorten this chapter and leave it to the documents and the witnesses whom I shall call to give the picture of the atrocities suffered by the Jews of the Soviet Union. I doubt whether I have words at my command to describe these terrible deeds in full. Let me therefore quote one of the partisan poets who wrote Shmerke Kaczarginsky, and I quote, "Quiet, quiet, my son, let us speak softly. Here grow the graves which they that hate planted. Here are the paths. The roads lead to Ponar. There is no way back. Father has gone never to return, and with him the light. Quiet, my son, my treasure. Let us not cry in pain. In any case, we have wept. The enemy does not understand. The sea has limits and a shore. This, our suffering, is limitless, is endless.